Okay, now we come to the question about the tenants and the letting side of the business. So obviously the government has announced the moratorium on eviction. So essentially, for people who are not aware of this, nowadays you can't really evict the tenants, commercial or residential tenants, out of their units if they have been affected by this virus. But then that raises the question where if tenants started asking for rent reduction, some of them would be genuine, and there would probably be people trying to take advantage of that. So from an agent's point of view, how should you approach this?
Well, I think they need to ask some reasonable questions of the tenant, Jason. I think that they need to ask the tenant, for example, why is it that you are struggling? Have you lost your job? Or have you suffered a drop in income? What else has happened because of the coronavirus that puts you in the position where you're unable to pay all or part of your rent? So the letting agent is quite entitled to ask those questions to be satisfied that the person is in distress and cannot pay their rent because of the coronavirus. So I think you need to ask those questions. If the tenant is a public servant, then you'd have to think you're not in distress, you're still getting paid, you still have your job. So that's what I say. The letting agent should ask those questions to be satisfied that the person is genuinely in distress. If the tenant is looking for a rent reduction, again, ask those questions. I think it's important though that if the owner and the tenant want to agree on a reduced rental, which is a better outcome than getting no rent, but I think if they do agree on a reduced rental, then the letting agent and the owner should insist that the rent is only reduced provided the tenant continues to pay the rent on time. I think that's important.
Yeah.
And don't forget to have that writing.
Yeah, and obviously any arrangement that you come to with the tenant, it should be in writing. An exchange of emails is sufficient. Most managers will have a hard file for each of their properties. So if you have an exchange of email where you and the tenant agree on a reduced rent, then print that email out and keep that on file somewhere. Obviously, the letting agent can't agree to reduce the rent unless the owner has approved that. So they need to get the owner's approval to that first.
If someone has requested a rental reduction, and then obviously the agent will need to talk to the owner, how much information can the agent disclose about this issue? Is the owner entitled to actually see for example, a positive testing of the COVID-19, or is it just a general information saying, we lost a job and we can't pay rent?
Whatever information you, the agent, collect from the tenant, you're quite entitled to pass that on to the owner. So whatever you find out, whatever information you get, you can pass that on to the owner because you are the owner's agent. So have no fears about passing on that kind of information that you've got from the tenant. So you really have to exercise, the letting agent, you have to exercise your discretion and your common sense about what you ask. Someone doesn't need to prove positive to COVID-19 to be in distress and not able to pay their rent. Mm-hmm. Almost every employee is going to suffer some drop in income in the next couple of months. There'll be some industries where that won't happen, but if your tenant is someone who's been working in retail, for example, well, they're going to suffer a loss. As I said before, if it's a public servant, then they shouldn't suffer a loss. So you just need to get the information from your tenants to be able to establish that they are suffering a loss because of the COVID-19, and that's impacting on their capacity to pay the rent. And then you can pass all that information on to the owner. And at the end of the day, it's up to the owner to decide if they're going to reduce the rent.
Okay. So under the current requirements, even though the agent cannot evict the tenant, that doesn't mean the tenant can just stop paying rent. The rent is still rent. So if they've been living there, cannot pay the rent, it will just become a huge debt, for example, by the end of the 6 months, and then they will still need to pay that back to the owner. Am I correct to understand it that way?
Jason, that's my understanding as well, but we have not yet seen the legislation, so we can't say for certain, but that is the expectation, that the rent will still be owing. However, I think we can expect the government to bring in some laws around that, because if they're going to stop landlords from terminating tenancies for a 6-month period, because of the serious problems that tenants, through no fault of their own, are in, then you would hate to think that in 6 months' time, that tenant is going to have a bill which they can never pay, and that they can also be recorded on ticker or somewhere as a very bad tenant. So I'm not sure what the government's going to do, but they may place some restrictions around what a landlord can then do at the end of that 6 months. We just don't know, and I suspect that that's why it's taking them so long to come out with the changes to the law, because they're working their way through all of these things.
Yeah, just on this topic, landlords can go to their banks and seek a moratorium on that as well, isn't it, John?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, as has been well publicised, the banks are offering to any of their customers, whether they be investors or homeowners, to apply for a moratorium on repayments to the bank during that, for a 6-month period. Whatever happens, the banks aren't going to forget about the interest you haven't paid. So that'll be added on to your debt. There's no doubt about that. So that's going to be something which you're going to have to face in 6 months' time, but at least it's going to help you get through the problems if you've got a tenant who just can't pay rent.